In this video, I'll show you my technique for painting fabric and clothing using Corel Painter 12. So in my example here, you can see I have this blue dress, and it's got contour to the body and form and texture and shading. Looks pretty realistic. So I'll show you how you can accomplish something similar. The first thing you want to do is create a rough sketch of your person that you're doing here. I didn't bother doing arms or legs because there weren't going to be any for this particular piece of clothing, so I just did something that looks like a mannequin. I accomplished that by making a new layer and then using the detail oils brush with a pretty thin brush to just sketch in a human shape here. And I'm not going to go into detail about how to draw human anatomy in this video. I'll do it in another one. But it should be pretty easy to accomplish for this because you're not really going to be drawing a person, you're just going to be drawing fabric. So don't stress over it too much if it's not super detailed and perfect. The important thing is that you measure how many heads high your person is. So you probably want them to be, something like, I don't know, 7 or 6 heads high, somewhere around there. Could be more, could be less, depending on what you want to do. When you got your rough sketch, you can do another layer on top of that and then turn down the opacity of your rough sketch. And on your new layer, you can, of course, go through and refine this to make it look a little bit better, however you want. So you should end up with something that looks like this, or, however your person's going to look, but you just kind of want a little cleaner of a sketch. So after we have our sketch done, then we can start adding what I like to call flat color. So that's just the basic outline of the dress without worrying about shading it or anything. That should look something like this, and I'll show you how I made it. What I did is I made a new layer, call it flat or whatever you want, or dress. Don't really worry about the color too much, just make it something that you can see because we can change the color later pretty easily. Just going to go with this blue, and the brush we want to use to do this is the scratchboard tool, which is in the pens category. The reason why we want to use it is because it's really opaque and it has a nice smooth edge. You want to make sure that your opacity is up all the way. So you can go through and draw on your dress. Don't really worry about getting it perfect because we can smudge this color around and refine it. So just kind of put in a basic dress shape. Don't worry about erasing it or redrawing it or any of that stuff. Just fill it in with anything, really. Try to get most of the work done with this brush in as few brush strokes as possible. So as I mentioned, we're going to smudge some stuff around. We can do that using some of the distortion tools in the effects menu. So we'll try Distorto. This works kind of like finger paint where it can push and it can pull. So it's additive and it's subtractive. Regular brush, generally, depending on which medium, is generally additive, and the eraser is subtractive. So this tool does both. It adds and it subtracts by smudging. Now, you probably are going to want to be able to see some of these body contours that are underneath from our mannequin. So if you want, you can make your flat a little more transparent using the opacity slider here, and then that way you can see all of the body parts underneath. So you want to try to get it most of the way there. If you want to fix these jagged edges, that's pretty easy to do. The way you do that is you use the pinch brush, which is again in the effects menu. What the pinch brush does is it pulls pixels in towards its center. So you can see the center point of my brush here, that dot in the center. As I'm pushing down and wiggling and moving my brush back and forth, it's pulling pixels in towards that point. So it's kind of a neat trick you can do where if you draw along the edge of a jagged line, it'll smooth it. So I'm drawing back and forth to smooth out that line. I'm kind of polishing it or kind of whittling away at it, or I don't know, pinching it together. Sometimes it works good with a bigger brush too. So then where our hips are, we want the dress to kind of come straight down at that point to make it look like it's got gravity making it hang downwards. And then at the bottom of the dress, we kind of want to make it look maybe a little wrinkled or something like this. So you can spend as much time refining this and getting it looking how you want. What we'll end up with is, again, something like this. And we can refine it more later, so don't stress over it too much. Rather than do our shading on this layer, let's make a new layer for that. But we want to confine all that shading inside of this shape so that we don't paint outside of it. So the way we do that is on our dress flat layer, we right click on it and we select layer content, and that puts a selection around this dress, but it also allows us to move to a new layer, and that selection will go with us to that new layer. So that way if we start painting on that new layer, and let's name that shading, that way you can see what I'm doing here. On this new shading layer, if we want to add anything to that, it kind of ends up on its own here. So you can see it's there, and then this dress layer underneath is just something entirely independent from that. So again, we do a right click on our layer that we want to make a selection around, which is our flat layer. Select layer content, make a new layer, and then make sure you move to that layer by clicking on it, and then hide your selection with Control-Shift-H on your keyboard. And we'll change the blend mode of this new shading layer to multiply. And we'll, with our brush tool selected, we will hold down Alt on our keyboard to sample this base color here for our dress. And let's darken it a little bit for our shading. And we'll use the digital airbrush for this with a pretty big brush and a low opacity of 9. And believe it or not, this dress is pretty much just a cylinder if you're going to think of it as a primitive shape. So we just need to shade it like a cylinder. So we'll need to decide where our light's coming from. Let's say it's coming from the top right here. So we'll just shade the left side of this dress. Like that. And along the bottom you could put in a little dark area here. And then if you wanted to on the straps, on the edge to make it look kind of thick. And then of course we're going to want to be able to see this body contour underneath. So we'll go back to our dress flat layer and we'll turn down the opacity a little bit so we can see the body parts underneath. Go back to the shading layer and continue adding shading wherever we need it. Some kind of creases here from the dress that will indicate. So you can get your contour looking the way you want by adding shading, and then if you want to blend it, you can use the diffuse blur blender brush to blend it around a little bit. When you've got something that you like, we can go ahead and move on. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit. This is how I have my dress shaded. We'll add some highlights the same way by right clicking on the flat layer, doing select layer content, hiding the selection with Control-Shift-H, and adding a new layer, and we can call it highlights or whatever you want to call it. And we'll make that a screen blend mode, and we'll pick a lighter color. Again, you can sample your base color and then just lighten it. And we'll use the digital airbrush for that as well, and then we'll go through and we'll add highlights wherever we want them. Okay. And again, you know, you can spend a little more time than I'm spending on this. I'm just kind of jumping around here. But once you've got your highlights, you should have something more or less like this. You know, you want to, if you have wrinkles here, again, you want to shade them where you have your light on one side and your dark on the other, like I have down here in this little area towards the bottom. Same thing with all the underlying body parts. You have to make it stick out in some places by adding highlights, and you have to make it sink in by adding shadows in other places. So that's the first step. Now if we move on to the next step, what we do is we're going to merge our layers together. So the way we do that is with our highlight, our shadow, and our flats. We want to select them all together. So what we do is we hold down Shift and we select from our highlight to our flat. So our highlight is the highlight we put on, the shadow is the shadow, and the flat is the flat. So we want all these together. And when they're all selected, we can do Control E on our keyboard, and that will merge them into a single layer. So now those three separate layers have become united into one single layer. So when we've got that, we can call it dress merged or something. I'm just going to label it that so that you know what it is. And we have that here in our example too. So this is the dress merged together. So then what I did after I merged it is I went through and I blended and smudged it a little bit, like this. So I'll go back and show you how I did that. So on our dress merged layer, we can use some different tools. Distorto works really well, and a lot of the distortion tools. So we'll turn on preserve transparency. This will make sure that we can't paint outside of what's on this layer. So what's on this layer is this shape here. So anything we do outside of that won't get affected. It'll only get affected inside of this shape. So I'm going to use the distortion tool to maybe smudge some stuff around, make it look like it's kind of wrinkled. And you can really go to town on this. You don't really want to mess up your forms too much, but in a couple spots here and there, just kind of, it's hard to see. I'm just doing little short smudges. I'll do a big one here so you can see what I mean by smudging. See how I'm pulling? I'm doing that same action, but I'm just doing it in little short little smudges. That's making the fabric look kind of wrinkled. I don't want to do it in the wrong place, because if I do it here and I go across where my leg's supposed to be, that's not going to look right. So there's, you want to use your imagination and start thinking about how your fabric's formed and do it in a logical way. You don't want to just, there's no magic trick to just go over it and go like this and it's going to look like fabric. You got to really do it in the right places for the right reasons. Make it look a little more wrinkled there. If we want to pinch some stuff together, we can do that. Like if we think that this chest is too far apart, we can use a big pinch brush to kind of pinch in some of the cleavage there. We can go along the edge to make it kind of pop out more. Anywhere we want. We can do the same thing on our creases to make our creases really stand out. And if you find that you smudged something too much or you pinched it too much and it's too sharp, just go through the diffuse blur blender and just blend it a little bit, and that'll soften it. Make it less sharp. So in a way, if you start thinking of this whole thing as being a piece of fabric, the way you're interacting with it is quite like fabric. You can pinch it together and fold it and move it around, and it kind of moves like fabric. So you'll want to go through and actually add creases and folds and things to make it look more realistic. So once you've got something that you're satisfied with, like I have here in my example, then we can move forward again and we can add some texture to this. So here's my dress and my sketch on our next example, and we can add some texture. I'll show you how I did that. You can see if I zoom in, this is the texture layer that I added. I'll show you how I accomplish this. We make a selection, of course, around our flat or our shaded dress layer here. Hide the selection with Control-Shift-H. Make a new layer. Call it texture or whatever you want. Make it a multiply blend mode. Make sure your preserve transparency is not turned on for this. And we want a darker blue color, something like that. And the brush we'll use for this is the square chalk brush. We'll change our paper settings to artist canvas or something like that looks like fabric. Artist canvas works well. Gessoed canvas retro fabric, you can use, you know, different combinations of these. I'm going to use artist canvas. You want to set the paper scale pretty low and the paper contrast about a third of the way up, somewhere around there. You want to make sure that you have a pretty low opacity brush, something like 10. And you also want to make sure that your brush is calibrated by doing a very firm brush stroke in your brush calibration palette. And then that way when you put down this texture, it'll just show up really subtly rather than too strong. So with a pretty good sized brush here, let's zoom out so we can see the whole dress at once. And let's lightly, with light pressure, or whatever it takes to get this texture here. You want a texture like that. You don't want something like this where it builds up too thick. You just kind of want some here and some there. Good balance, something like that. And I'll zoom in so you can see what I did here. So you can see it's got just a subtle little amount of texture over the whole thing. And we could turn down the opacity of that layer to kind of blend it a little better with the layer underneath. You don't want it to be too distinct. Now, we need to blend that a little bit so it's not so uniform. So we'll use the diffuse blur blender for that. And you want to use pretty light pressure, and you want to follow whatever contours are in your dress. So most of my contours are pretty vertical, so I'm just going to do some light blending vertically. I don't want to destroy all of this here though, because if you blend it too hard, you'll blend all your texture away. So you just want to lightly blend it, just kind of move it around a little bit. So you should have something like that for your texture. And then we can add some tint, which is pretty subtle. We'll do that. We should still have our selection active if we haven't deselected it. So we should just be able to add a new layer here and still retain that selection. We'll call it tint. Change the blend mode to multiply. We can pick maybe like a pale orange color like this. What the tint will do is it'll just vary this blue color a little bit in some places, so to make the fabric look just a little more natural, I think. So you don't want to over tint it like this and like turn it green, but just in a few places here and there, just add a little bit of tint. It's really, really subtle, so if you don't really notice it that much, that's better. Something like that for the tint. And if I turn off the dress, you can kind of see this tint that I added. It is pretty subtle, and the texture is also very subtle too. So that's our tint and our texture. So you should end up with something kind of like this. And then I decided to add a little more highlights. If you decide you need more highlights and shadows, you can continue doing it the same way that I was doing it, by selecting your dress outline shape, your main shape here, doing select layer content, and then I added a new layer that was a screen layer. And what I did is I just went along the other side of it, the lighter side, and then just lightened it with a lighter blue color, adding a little more highlight there. So I felt that it needed that to pop out more. And then finally, we can put the finishing touches by doing a few things. So we'll go through a little more in a few places and pinch and just kind of refine the shape. I fixed some of these edges because I didn't like them. So, for instance, you know, if I decide that I don't like the way that this piece comes into the armpit here, I can smudge it around a little bit. Oops, I need the distortion tool for that. And make sure you don't have anything selected by doing Control D to deselect. And then I can kind of smudge this around to get it looking the way I want. So I'm really just kind of putting the finishing touches on everything, and you know, if I don't like the way that these body parts look, I can fix them, or if they're too big, I can shrink them by going to pinch and making a pretty big brush and shrinking some stuff. Whatever you want to do at this point. You could even go through and add more wrinkles and things too, using the pinch brush. So that's your basic fabric tutorial there. there's some more advanced stuff that I'll get into in another video, so we can make some more layered fabric and things that it's a little more complex. Finally, you could add a little background layer here, put this behind your dress. I just did like just a little strip. You can kind of see it down here at the bottom. Just a little back area of dark color to make the dress look like it's got, you know, it's cylindrical, like there's a hole on the bottom of it, so it doesn't look like a flat curtain or something. It's kind of optional. I would recommend adding some stuff like that, though, to make it stand out. Then if you wanted to go through and add some more details to your dress, like you wanted to put a pattern on it or add some embroidery and things, you can do that all on new layers as well. Now, as I mentioned, you might not want a blue dress, so if you decide you don't and you want to change the color of it after the fact, when you're done with everything, flatten all of the components of your dress into a single layer. So all I have here is this final dress in the background. I'm going to select them both. I'm going to do Control E to merge them. And then you can go to the effects menu up here and go to tonal control and adjust colors. And then if you use the hue shift, you can change the color of the whole dress to whatever color you want. So that's pretty cool. So if you want a green dress, now you have a green dress. And you can keep changing that as much as you want. So hopefully you can use this for some of your work at home, and you can have some fun painting fabric and clothing. And again, stay tuned for my next tutorial on fabric that'll be a little more advanced, and it'll show you how to draw some more complex, overlapping, flowing fabric. Thanks for watching.